we always tell our members, this is why it is so important for you to have that information, that plan in place to how to gather the information, how to store it, and how to bring it up and retrieve it quickly for anybody that needs to see it for an investigative purpose.
Welcome to another edition of Solving Your Driver Problem. I'm Scott Ray, the host, today with Irwin Shires. He is the Vice President of Education and Engagement at the Ohio Trucking Association. He's the new kid on the block over there after spending 19 years at Panther Logistics in government qualifications. So he's coming from the belly of the beast on the government side, but he was on the dark side, folks. He was with us on our side here, and he's going to share with us all those years of wisdom and expertise that he gained for us today. Irwin, welcome.
Thanks, Scott. Very happy to be here.
And well, let's jump right into it. I was going to say I did miss one important piece of the introduction, is that what makes him most qualified is that a second place finish on Jeopardy, which I think you're the highest qualified person we've ever had here on Solving Your Driver Problem. So congratulations.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It was definitely part of my learning experience.
Well, let's see hopefully we'll come up with some questions. If they had any on driver compliance files or FMCSA audits, I'm sure you nailed them. So we'll get right into it. So you spent 19 years at Panther. What were some of the key lessons learned for managing government compliance that you could share to, Ohio Trucking Association members or any carrier out there?
Sure. It's one of those things where you come into it sideways, because it was never my intention to be, a compliance guy. I had drove professionally for 9.5 years. And shortly after my son was born, an opportunity came up with the company. I'd started working at Panther, or driving for Panther, and they had this opening to sort of work in their relations department to mentor new drivers. So it was sort of a combination of, you get to train people or help train people beyond just the standard training, and sort of help them along by offering them coaching and mentoring. And I enjoyed it. I jumped at it. It was fun. It was a quick segue from there into actual training, or doing the orientations and everything. I did some ops for a while, and then this opportunity came up because as a DoD contractor, there's a rather lengthy process involving getting your secret clearance, which you have to have in order to be an ammunition explosives hauler. So I had already got my clearance because the ops department I was in was the one that handled the government stuff. So they asked me to sort of mentor or shepherd everyone through that process. And so that's how I got into the government compliance stuff. So it ended up being sort of a two-pronged attack for me, doing the DoD compliance. And then from there, it was a simple segue into handling all the DOT compliance stuff that we were doing already. So I learned that along the way.
So as you reflect back on those learnings of 19 years, if you're a safety director out there today at ABC Co. and you've got a couple hundred drivers, or you've got 50 drivers, you had some at Panther. You guys had you're a large organization. You had resources. What though would you give the advice would you give for that person? Just those lessons learned for the safety director with a couple hundred drivers or 50 drivers.
Well, I don't think to your point, I know there's a difference certainly in time investment when you're dealing with 50 drivers versus 1,000 or more. From a compliance standpoint, and from where you want to be so that you're prepared, because I know everybody's tied into, qualifications and preparing for an audit and that sort of thing, when the FMCSA or PUCO, especially in Ohio, come calling and they ask to see certain things, you want to have them ready. The larger you get, and the number when you start out small is always tied to, what can you afford to do? And it's usually just one or two drivers. And then at that point, it's fairly simple for one person to handle that process of getting those qualification files prepared, making sure everything's in them that needs to be. But as you grow, and certainly as you get more drivers and you expand your fleet, you want to look very early on at getting a dedicated person to handling all of the compliance requirements, because there are just so many of them. And some are at a state level, some of them are at a national level. and you have different agencies coming at you asking for different things, making sure that you have a file complete with all that between the qualifications of a driver, that you've checked their background, that you have a drug screen program in place, both a pre-employment one and a random one. It can quickly get out of hand and can quickly overwhelm a person, especially if that person is also working on the financial aspect of the business, is trying to sell the service, whatever service they're providing within the industry. You can really find yourself overwhelmed and falling by the wayside. So it really is important for you to be on top of the compliance aspect of it quickly and stay there. Don't let that part of the process of the business development overwhelm you.
So just because it's ever changing, a giant bird, it just is what it is, right? It's a burden. A dedicated brain, as soon as you've got enough drivers to justify it, invest in that resource for the owner, the manager, the president, for that sleep easy at night medicine. Because this doesn't, as we talk about compliance, it's not designed to drive your business forward. And as an owner, that's what you want to think about. You want to think about growing your business. You want to think about keeping the wheels running. So with that frame of mind, what guidance do you have for people, beyond just a dedicated person? What guidance do you have for setting up systems so that managing compliance doesn't interfere with running daily operations?
Well, as we move, further and further into the 21st century, of course, the goal is to, chop down as few trees as possible. Unfortunately, in so many government aspects of dealing with the government, they tend to be a little behind on that process, and they figure it hasn't really happened until the piece of paper is in their hand.
Yeah. Shocking. Government's slow. Yeah.
That's exactly. So it's a sort of two-pronged thing. Now, we are fortunate now that there are such good cloud-based resources in order to save all the documentation that you would need. So the forms can be electronically completed, transmitted, and saved. And that is making such a huge difference in fleets, especially large ones, in terms of being able to store data quickly and efficiently, and to be able to, more importantly, in an audit situation, to be able to recall that data when you need it. Now, you still get the auditors that show up on site and they want to print it out thing, and they'll actually, they'll email you those in advance. They do random stuff. You send them a driver roster, and they'll say, I'm kind of picking 10 of these guys out at random, or 5 based on that, and I want to see all of their stuff. And you go in and you find the appropriate person in their cloud-based support, print off what they want, show it to the auditor, and then at the end it goes right back down to the shredder box at the other end of the building. Can you tell I was in charge of that part of the process? It was, but as you know, when you're smaller, especially when you're starting out, you want to be able to, the policies that need to be in place. And what, fortunately for the government, as long and convoluted as some of their requirement documentation is, it is readily available. And when you're starting out, especially first, and you may only have to deal with 1 or 2 drivers, you get a liaison or an auditor that will help you through the process up front, so that you get that information in advance saying, this is what your file needs to look like. These are all the things you need to have in it. Make sure they're all in place. And then recurring documentation then usually on an annual basis for much of it. Some of it's quarterly, some of it's annual, and some of it maybe every 3 years. But once you have all those, that schedule in place to know when those things are due for updating, renewal, what have you, it becomes a much more easier thing to maintain. So the goal is always to create the appropriate documents up front, make sure they're complete, make sure they're accurate, and then know how to maintain it in a way that it's, like, say, not taking up dozens of file drawers in a cabinet in a room that nobody goes into, more so that you've got a cloud-based system in place that you can recall the documents when an auditor comes asking for them.
Absolutely. I heard a couple things there to dive a little deeper in, but just to highlight some things I heard that, I've seen that have been extremely helpful, and obviously a little biased because we make some of those, but the key is collecting the data cleanly up front the first time. And because that back and forth, if it's in a paper world, is just really, it's no good. It's no good for anyone. It's no good for the driver. It's a good way to lose a candidate before they come on, because really it's the antiquated way. And so if it's got to be simple, it's got to be done on a phone for the driver in order to complete that information. And then to your point, when you hit the button that says hire, approve, contract, whatever that button says, that you know that the system has said, we've got all the documents in file, and you can sleep at night, that you've got everything in place. To go back to something you brought up though a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. So we enjoy making fun of the government. It's always a crowd pleaser, especially in trucking. But there appears to be some rumbles of offsite audits, and you actually educated me on this, which is why we brought you on the show today. And I'll just kind of backfill for the audience who may not know that we saw in 2017 that there was a report that FMCSA that submitted to Congress and demonstrated that an offsite audit, it took 33% less time. That makes sense. They saved 58% on travel costs. We saw a 300% increase in those offsite audits of 2018, 2019. But as you educated me on, is that those were not on official record, right? There was some type of study they were doing to prove this. Official record is still in person, on paper, right? Those is kind of the old way we've always done it. Right. So you've got some inside information, or at least you've kind of seen again through the belly of the beast. What is your prediction? And again, predicting the government is not a good game to be in. So I don't want to put you on the spot where you're not comfortable. Where do you see this going?
Well, there's a legal answer, I guess, for lack of a better term, and then there's a realistic answer. What we found with the what we call the desktop audit, for lack of a better term, the idea that you can, an auditor can send you a request for documentation, which is what they do ahead of a regular audit anyway, because they want you to have the stuff, because they don't want to show up at your place and then sit around all day while you're just printing stuff off and bringing it to them. They want you to have that stuff ready when they arrive, because it's usually a ream of paper that they have to then sit and sift through. So if they waste a whole day sitting there waiting for the paperwork, that it just puts them in a bad mood, and you don't want that when they get there. You want them to get there and know you are prepared. That's the number one thing to keep them in a fairly happy mood. The desktop thing was put in place usually for unrated or what we call whistleblower audits. So if a driver called in and said, this driver or this vehicle owner or this company supervisor or dispatcher maybe do something that violated a regulation, and then they've got to follow up on that. Those audits tend to be unrated for the most part. They just simply, they'll discover a finding or no finding. If there's a finding, they'll recommend a course of action and you carry on. But there's no, unless it's some serious accusation or an egregious situation, an acute or critical violation, a failure of institutional control, managerial control standpoint, where they might risk dropping their rating from satisfactory to conditional. But the vast majority of these desktop things were simply a whistleblower or just a specific area. And those can continue. And since COVID's happened and they've got everybody, not traveling basically, they've been using this from an emergency standpoint. In fact, the declaration came out and said that we were allowed to continue to use these for the common type audit that we have been, and in an emergency situation, we can use it to for new carriers that are trying to get their initial rating. But it's only a temporary measure, that when the emergency declaration is lifted, that the on-site audits will pick back up again. Now, we've advocated in favor of desktop audits for years, for those of us that have been trying to show an alternative to the what we call the CSA audit, where you use the compliance, safety, accountability scores that have been out for nearly 10 years now as a sort of de facto system of auditing a carrier, and using those scores as a means to show up for an audit. We found that some of those scoring, the data behind, or the data probabilities and the equations used to create those scores were flawed, and they created inherent biases against certain types of carriers that operated in certain states, large versus small carriers. There was a variety of them. And so we advocated very hard 5 years ago prior to the FAST Act being passed that those scores needed to be taken away from public view and be revamped to a much more stringent method that would allow a more accurate reflection of a carrier's actual safety profile. In lieu of that, we said that the even stronger version would be to have the FMCSA conduct these desktop audits as actual audits of carriers, to say that I have had personal contact with someone at a facility, at a carrier, and say I've reviewed their documents and found them to be satisfactory, which would allow them in a shorter period of time to touch a much higher percentage of the carriers out there, which is their mandate in the first place. I mean, that's what they're supposed to be doing. So to do it in a de facto way, by using these CSA scores, we felt they were sort of giving up part of their authority. And I know that's not their intention, and it certainly was not the intention of the FMCSA to do that. It was an unintended consequence, but because they were unwilling to listen to us, we ended up forcing a congressional action to make them do it. And I don't mean to get ahead here, but the unfortunate thing is now this transportation bill that just got to the House floor this past week includes a provision that would make the old scores public again unless some revision is completed. And we're obviously arguing very vigorously against that provision, because the method that was put out in the FAST Act was very specific and had bipartisan support and allowed the process to play out properly. So we hope that obviously that provision is allowed to continue through the new version of the bill. But that's really what you need to look at when you're preparing yourself either for an audit or creating your audit game plan up front, is expect them to be there and expect to have the documentation ready for them. But hopefully going forward, you'll be able to do these desktop audits. But to do a desktop as an actual compliance audit for a rating, to change it from a desktop to an in-person thing will take an act of Congress to do that. And it's not going to happen in this current transportation bill. It would most likely need to be part of the next one whenever that happens.
We want to thank you for taking time to listen to Solving Your Driver Problem. If you like the ideas you're hearing and want more information, please subscribe to our blog. You'll receive a weekly email newsletter where, just like this podcast, we're sharing the best ideas and tactics in the industry for improving driver recruiting, compliance, training, and retention. Go to avatarfleet.com/blog to subscribe. While you're there, check out how our software and services are helping our clients hire more drivers while cutting their ad spend in half, achieve driver qualification file compliance in half the time, and reducing claims by 30%. That's avatarfleet.com/blog or avatarfleet.com to check out our products and services. Got it. So, and just for clarification for everyone out there, the offsite audits are on the record as long as the national emergency declaration is in place. And is it just coincides exactly? And that's kind of is it exactly with that, Irwin, or is there an end date that's been marked on there? What do you know about that?
As far as being able to use it in lieu of the standard one, that will be in place until the emergency declaration is lifted. Now they could put a short extension on it. They'll say if they've already scheduled some for like 30 days beyond,
okay,
that will continue to go ahead, and then anything past that will be returned to an in-person situation. But any audit, no matter who does it or the scope of it, will show up on a carrier's profile. So if you go into the FMCSA website and you type in a carrier's DOT number, you can look at each of the, they can audits back 10, 15, 20 years as long as they've had them. You'll be able to see if an audit was conducted and when. The type of audit was a full compliance audit, a whistleblower audit, a special circumstance audit. And it'll say if a rating was issued or not. In most cases, these recent ones, it'll say no rating or non-rated audit. And when I was at Panther, the last 3 of them, in fact, that I went through with them were called non-rated audits. So it was just, yes, we were there. There was no finding that required any follow-up, beyond something, cosmetic or, circumstantial thing that was handled internally, but nothing that needed to be broadcast to the public.
So are these offsite audits that increase that we saw between 18 and 19, 2018, 2019, was that strictly for this report they were submitting to Congress, or are they using this tool more as a quick way, an identifier to see, it's a quick way to poke the bear, the carrier, to see if there's anything more interesting to come and visit an offsite? How are they using this tool, and why was that increase so sharp?
Well, you probably have to ask someone at the agency specifically as to why the number went up so quickly. It's a logical guess to say that they were trying to, when you say something enough, you hope that someone there will listen and say, well, maybe they're not just blowing smoke here. They might have a legitimate point. And so part of that might have been, their version of experiment with, hey, we have this many auditors in our employment. We have this many carriers, which is a giant number compared to who they have. But they said, maybe if we just look at the rate at how long it would take us to complete these non-rated audits, based on the documentation we need to look at, and say, if you give somebody X amount of time to locate documentation, they know it's not enough time for them to make something up that wasn't there, but just enough time to actually have them go in and retrieve it. That you can say, yeah, okay, to the best of our knowledge, which is how all these are set up anyway. Yep. To the best of our knowledge, this carrier provided this documentation. We've certified it to be accurate, or if it's lacking in some way, we find it to be lacking in this way. They have assured that their program has been adjusted to reflect an improvement in this procedure, or what have you. At that point, you then say, all right, I have had an in-person or a direct contact audit, I guess, much like we're having now. I guess you'd call this a direct contact as opposed to in-person, since we're not together. But we're having direct contact by having this conversation back and forth. The agency was able to realize that they can have, with the technology exists now, that they can have these conversations with someone in real time. And they can ask them questions. They can ask follow-ups to the documentation they've been provided. And based on that information, a person can complete the audit requirements that they need to in a much shorter time frame. And that was the whole point of what we were trying to say, is that your job is to make contact with these carriers. This allows you to do it in a much more efficient manner and still accomplish your mandate of determining the carrier is compliant. So that would be the best guess of why they suddenly increased it. And then again, the COVID thing allowed them to maintain or maybe even increase it further. And hopefully, I guess if there's going to be any kind of silver lining coming out of what we've experienced the last 6 months, one of them would be the fact that they may have seen the light as to being able to complete these types of audits and be able to show a dramatic increase in the number of carriers they actually maintain regular contact with, which again is their actual mandate. So if there is any ray of light to it, it would be that.
I'll be happier. We'd be spending less money, as with less public tax dollars would be spent. You wouldn't have an auditor breathing down your neck. You could do it at the lunch hour, especially if you're already digital, quick download, upload. It would be significantly smoother, right, for everyone.
Exactly, on both sides. It wouldn't. There's an inherent fear among carriers that once an auditor is in their building, how do you strike the balance of being cordial and professional and providing them everything without trying to just sort of let them wander through every aspect of every step of their business? Which, let's face it, the agency could theoretically do that if they want to. But if they've explained the scope of their investigation or audit is going to be non-rated, focused specifically on a whistleblower event, then there are regulations in place that say that that's the area they have to, if they've told you that's why they're coming, they can't just suddenly show up and say, well, while we're here, we're going to look at everything else. Okay. Yeah. Unless, and this is an important thing, there is an additional finding in the course of what they are looking at. Then they can explore that avenue as well. So you can see a carrier that is unprepared or has some systemic flaws or managerial control problems, how those things can quickly spiral out of hand. So we always tell our members, this is why it is so important for you to have that information, that plan in place to how to gather the information, how to store it, and how to bring it up and retrieve it quickly for anybody that needs to see it for an investigative purpose.
Sure. So I've got a two-part question for you here. You sparked this by the statement "to the best of our knowledge," and something that I've heard in my experience from our clients is there's some gray when it comes to interpreting the rules, the regulations, and that's it's not just limited to FMCSA or DOT. Think about from a tax standpoint when you get audited, right? When you've got any situation, you've got rules a mile long. There's opportunity for improvement or for interpretation. Definitely improvement too, but interpretation is where my question is going. So I don't have a specific scenario. It's more of a, what we preach is consistency. So if there's anything, if you're doing it, just do it the same way over and over again and document it, right? If it didn't document, it didn't happen. And so my question is, how did you and how do you address any areas of potential gray within the regulations? And then diving into that, where do you go to help seek guidance on those interpretations, or even staying up to date on the regulations? However you want to answer that.
Sure. It's funny you don't want to. You have to give credit where credit's due, and in the case of FMCSA, there are people in place that will happily share with you their interpretation of something. Now, where it sometimes gets gray is that their interpretation may not match the interpretation of someone who's actually coming to visit you. It really is, many of the, and to their point, many of the regulations are fairly cut and dried. I mean, there's, you are required to do this, you are required to not do this. Again, the gray area tends to be more in an overlap situation rather than, one person says one thing and one person says the opposite thing and they both insist that they're true. We obviously see enough of that in the world right now anyway. But in the area of regulations, sometimes the regulations will drift into overreach because one type of regulation, if it's changed frequently, will end up cannibalizing another one that maybe hasn't been changed. And what people will find as they either deal with an audit or as if it's affected their business directly because they get an update on a piece of information that's changed. And they'll look at it and say, well, we've had this has been in place. We've been doing it this way for years because we were told this is the right way to do it. Now you're telling us this change is required in order to stay compliant with this procedure. You can then go back and say, well, this contradicts this piece of the procedure that we've had in place. So should we do it this way or that way? If you get someone at the agency to look at the two contradicting aspects of a regulation or procedure, and get them to say, yeah, you should be doing it A way or B way. And you get them, either in writing or through conversation, but you get confirmation from them that this is the procedure to follow. Government agencies love to change their minds. I mean, that's just as much fun for them as anything else. So you have to be ready to roll and pivot and adjust as certain regulations get changed. What you really need to be proactive with then, again, is if you've got that plan in place and this regulation changes an aspect of that plan for documentation, make sure it doesn't contradict something that's already in place. Or if it does, you can go to the agency and get clarification. Now, if you're not comfortable with talking to the agency itself, there are plenty of other folks out there that have good working relationships with agency members that would be happy to ask those questions on your behalf. OTA happens to be one of them. I get members calling in all the time with in some cases there's simple rules interpretations, and based on experience or based on who you know or what you can get those answered very quickly. But in some cases, if it's an area of outside of maybe the expertise of the person you're asking, because we can't know everything, like you said, especially in terms of government stuff. They can always outlast you in time and outspend you in money, right? That's the old joke. But, if they're not sure about something, they'll just write another regulation that says, we're not sure about the previous one, so do this instead. You occasionally do need someone to sift through it and filter it down to its essence. And that's what I always try to do when I do my trainings. And that's in both when I was with Panther and when I do trainings now, or bring in people to talk about these things. You got to take the legalese or the government-ese of regulations and pull out the key words and convert them just enough into a straightforward narrative, so that when you're explaining it to compliance individuals, and especially when compliance individuals are explaining to the drivers, here's what we need from you. I mean, that really becomes the key part of this. And it's not to demean drivers in any way, but drivers have told me, we're very grateful that you can tell me what I don't need to read this 500-page manual of what the regulations are. Yeah. I need to know what I need to bring to orientation. I need to know what documentation I need to submit to you once a month, once a quarter, once a year, for me to stay compliant and keep rolling and making money.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to provide that information, you need to have a good relationship with the agency or agencies in the state of Ohio, multiple agencies that are part of your enforcement or regulation program. They're there. So and again, to their credit, they want you to ask questions. I've sat in meetings with them all the time. They say, look, we want you to ask the question before we come to the audit. We want to make sure you understand the rule or the requirement or the regulation before we ever formally set foot in your building or formally send you the email that says, provide us all this documentation. We want to make sure you know what you're doing before we actually show proof of that.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Ohio Trucking Association as a resource, because we should want a shameless plug here, because this is where we go when we've got questions. We've been members for over 6 years. The monthly safety meetings, depending on, sometimes on the topic, can be regulation related. Sometimes it's the source themselves, and that's a good time for OTA members to get access in a face-to-face setting for those questions that have been burning them or nagging them for a long time. And then I definitely love the hey, I'm asking for a friend, because there's certain things where you don't want to get it traced back to you, right, or have that potential, right? But to your point, my question was, where were you going to go? How do you stay up to date? And what I hear is just go to the source, and that's really how you stay up to date. Fair enough?
Right. Yeah. No, it's that really is it. You'll get interpretations. I mean, everybody can sign up for all of the daily and weekly, email blasts of information from various sources, and we provide our own as well. It's one of the things we're kind of proud of, especially during what we've dealt with here during COVID, is the information has changed so quickly and has gone in so many different directions. We wanted to make sure, we see our goal. One of our main services that we provide is we sort of a conduit between our members and either the regulatory agencies or the other members that may have answers to the questions. We want to make it easier for you to get the answers to the questions that you have, which in some case change day to day, week to week, about various things. Obviously, like say COVID being the big monkey in the room all first half of this year. But there's other areas too. As this happens, some aspects of regular life continue as well, and we need to stay on top of those as best we can. So it really has been our goal to provide our members with accurate, up-to-the-minute information as best we possibly can, without feeling like we're overwhelming them or just bombarding them with stuff, because we are aware in this current atmosphere that it's very easy for information fatigue to set in, whether it's just because you're seeing so much of it, or even doubting how much of it's true and how much of it isn't. We see that that whole fake news argument and everything, and it's very frustrating for those of us who are not trying to pitch any sort of political point of view, other than supporting our businesses, supporting our members to make sure that they survive this and somehow come out of this maybe hopefully in better shape, or at least in good enough shape that they can take advantage of hopefully whatever economic recovery we will see once we know we're out from under this pandemic, which again, right now, today seems almost as problematic as it did 3 months ago, because again, of all the conflicting information out there. So it really, the goal is always accurate information, and we strive to provide as much of it as we can in as timely a fashion as we can.
Well, I'd say you all have done a great job over the last 3 months putting that into place in terms of that information. And that's the value that I see is we could go to the source, from our interpretations or helping clients out in some cases. But it's a lot easier. That's the value that we see with OTA is the filtering down. And then when asking for a friend when needed is extremely valuable. So, on this, and we'll do one final shameless plug here, that Irwin and I were on a webinar for the Ohio Trucking Association just a few weeks ago on how to keep the recruiting and safety departments rolling during COVID-19. And the big theme of that presentation, yes, there were some best practices of what carriers have done over the last couple of months. But your point, the reason I bring that up, Irwin, is your point is there are some good things that are happening. There's businesses are getting stronger. There are things that we should have been doing all along that we put off until there was a good global pandemic to force us to see the light and do that spring cleaning or do those improvements or that enhancements that we've been needing to do and either didn't have time, didn't have the energy, or didn't even see it. There was a possibility until now. So we'll include that in our show notes as well, so people can have access to that. And we'll get out of here with this personal question, Erwin, that I ask everyone on the show, which is a little time of reflection here. So what accomplishment are you most proud of in your career and why?
I would say in my career, I would be proudest of the fact that we got those CSA scores hidden as part of the FAST Act. Because again, just to circle back how we started, I never envisioned 30 years ago when I started driving around the country making money, because I was having trouble getting a teaching job at the time, that I would end up, walking the halls of Congress and advocating on behalf of the trucking industry to right a wrong, if you kind of call it, or to improve on something. It's been a fascinating journey for me to see, to really see how that process works. And I know we like to make fun of the term, inside the beltway or belly of the beast, as you said earlier, but to actually be part of it and to see that it can work on almost a minute level in some way, but to, when there's a moment and an opportunity that you can present a common sense argument, that not to simply say it's right or it's wrong, but to say there's a flaw in this process and it needs to be fixed. And here are a couple of ways you can go about doing it. I think to discover the fact that you can present something that way and have it resonate with members of Congress on both sides and in both houses, that to me was very revealing. So, it's so, like I say, it's so easy to bash the government and bash Congress and that, that they can't get anything done when it seems so polarizing as it is now. But the glimmer of hope, I think, is that you can still make a common sense argument, and if enough people will stop long enough and listen to you and understand the point of view, not just the fact that I say something. It's like that old Monty Python routine, the argument clinic, where you just say, it's just contradiction. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. We see a lot of that right now, and it's frustrating for everybody. But there's an old quote that says, you cannot learn from one another until you stop shouting at one another. And my hope and my goal moving forward with my responsibility within this organization is to hopefully we can reduce the shouting down to back to normal conversation. And as we bring up issues where improvements need to be made, that we can relay them to the people that are in position to do something about it. And so the fact that I was able to start that process through advocacy in the FAST Act and getting those scores taken down I'm very proud of what we accomplished with that.
Yeah, very cool. I'm glad to know that I know the guy that did that. I remember how big of a deal that was for the industry, how big of a deal it is, and hopefully with this new transportation bill that we can revive common sense and perhaps, Irwin, we should sponsor tattoos from all members on Congress on their forehead to say, "You cannot learn from each other if you're shouting at each other." I love that quote.
I'll pay for at least one of them, maybe, how much those are. I am not a tattoo person, but I know a lot of people that are, including my wife and my son. So, have at it. I've had enough things drilled into me, so ink is not going to be one of them. But if you want it, have at it. I'm all for that.
Well, Irwin, thanks again for the time, the expertise, and the knowledge today. We appreciate it. So that has been another edition of Solving Your Driver Problem, where we dive into best practices for recruiting, compliance, safety, and retention. Irwin, thanks again for sharing your time, and everyone will catch you on the next episode.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for listening to Solving Your Driver Problem with Scott Bray. Check out avatarfleet.com/resources for more industry-leading materials on how to make the driver problem your competition's problem. That's avatarfleet.com/resources.